The question basically being in the hypostatic union, when I've asked Christians, how do you actually make sure, I've asked this to Christians, that you're only worshiping the 100% God in Jesus and not the 100% man, because they believe that he's both
right.
God and man. So, and I wanted to get your view, if you have asked to, since you have talked to a lot more Christians, that how do Christians actually make sure, even if they believe in the doctrine of the Trinity, I don't think there's any way to make sure that you only worship the God in Jesus, because you have to worship the man alongside if you're worshiping the person of Christ, right? So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. So that's it.
That's a really great question. I have heard that for years. I mean, years and years and years. They believe that Jesus is 100% man, but also 100% God. That idea alone has always baffled me, and it's like, wow, that's.
Yeah. So the simple question being that even if suppose that this is true, right? There's no way of knowing when you worship Jesus, how do you decouple this?
Right.
How do you only worship the God and not the man? So if you have any thoughts on that.
That's really good. So yeah, that's perfect. Thank you for calling in. That's a really great question.
If people believe in the doctrine that was hammered out as orthodoxy at the Council of Nicaea in 325, and in the end, the Bishop of Alexandria won and Arius lost, which means that Jesus and God are both eternal God, chas v'shalom, and that Jesus is very God, a very God, very light, a very light, and he's co-eternal with the Father. They're both God, but they're one God. They're not two, but they're two persons. This word "person" has no meaning. It's a term that was used that has no real meaning in any conventional sense. So it's a sort of special language because you can't answer it. And it was a surrender to the argument between the proponents that Jesus was divine, but not literally God, a God, but he isn't co-eternal with the Father, namely those who were the followers of this Alexandrian priest and preacher, Arius. They were called Aryans, not the Aryans with a Y that connected to the Nazis, but it's Aryan with an I. They lost in Nicaea. The gathering of bishops went in the other direction. If Christians believe that Jesus was fully God and fully human, which they 95% do, okay, that means that he wasn't 50-50. He was 100% God and 100% man. What do Christians do? How do they know what they're worshiping? This is a problem that Christians have to work out, and as it turns out, I have had Christians tell me, serious Christian scholars, pastors, who are friends of mine, and they will personally tell me that 95% or 75% or 80% of their congregants do not understand what the doctrine of the Trinity is. And the serious Christian scholars will all confess that all the parables of an egg, yolk, shell, white, none of them work. Any metaphor that you try to use, what is the atomic makeup of a water molecule, doesn't work. Why? Because the three atoms that make up the water molecule, well, hydrogen is not the same as oxygen. They're saying Jesus is the same as the Father. It does not work. And ultimately, it doesn't make sense. And in fact, the church will refer to this as the great mystery that no person can understand. Now, Judaism has no problem with mysteries. Of course, a God that I fully understand I can't worship. Of course there are mysteries in Tanakh. Of course there are. We're talking about God, the creator of the heavens and the earth. He has an infinite mind, I have a limited mind. So of course there are mysteries, but there can't be contradictions. Remember the former things from all eternity. Ki anochi kel, for I am God, ve'ein oid hasher, there is no other God, ve'efes kamaini. Ein oid elikim, there is no other God, efes kamaini, and there is nothing like me. Isaiah 46 verse 9. God means that. That's all. So I will say to you that Christians will ultimately say it's a mystery that we can't understand. And it's kind of, from my view, this question really should be asked to a Christian, not to me. From my view, Christians are simply tossing up to, I don't have an answer, because they're saying it's ultimately a mystery that we can't understand. I'm not saying that, of course we all know that God is mysterious. But what we have to worship, Christians cannot articulate. They can say the words, believe in one God, but three persons, but they can say the words come out, but they're saying X equals Y and X doesn't equal Y. That's the point. It has to collapse. And ultimately, the Council of Nicaea was a surrender. It can't be explained. They worked on it for centuries, from the time Paul was expressing the Carmen Christi, which was probably a pre-literary text in Philippians 2, all the way to the Council of Nicaea. They were screaming about it, and they screamed about it beyond 325. And that's why Theodosius, the last emperor of Rome that presided over the East and the West, had to reconfirm it because there were so many problems with it. And it still remains that way today. Even to this day, the biggest break between Christian denominations is exactly what do you believe about the Trinity? What person is Jesus? Believe me, this is a huge, huge issue. And it's for this reason that some Christians don't regard other Christians as real Christians and completely going to hell because they don't understand. Their concept of the nature of Jesus is unclear. So I believe there's two levels here. On the official church doctrinal level, they have the verbiage worked out. They sat over and used Platonic language to say words that can be found in the Nicene Creed. But in fact, then there's a second question I posit from my anecdotal observation. That is that many Christians, almost every Christian I have had a personal conversation with, can't work it out personally. I think that deep down, many Christians really feel like God the Father is the great, great God. That's what I think is going on. So there's two levels. One is, what is my official beliefs and policy? But it can't transfer to what's really going on when I'm worshiping. And that's your question. Why? Because you need more than verbiage. It has to map onto experience. It has to map onto what you do and how you believe and what's going on here and here. And that's different. You can control words. You can read off a nice statement. You can read off the doctrines that emerged over a council in the 4th century. But how do you translate that into your actual behavior if it's a mystery that's incomprehensible? So what I think is going on, and William, you were a Christian. You can disagree with me. I think that Christians really see the Father, not officially, not what they'll tell you, but what's going on is they see the Father as the grand God created the heavens and the earth.
Right.
And they will say Jesus was God. They'll argue with the witnesses up and down, the Unitarians up and down, with the Muslims up and down. But in their heart, Jesus is ultimately God Jr., somebody who is a servant of God, and he is someone who does only what the Father tells him and what he sent him for, John 5:30. And the Father is greater than I am. And don't touch me yet, because Jesus says to Mary, I did not ascend to my God and your God. Well, that's John. That's the last gospel. That's the most improved gospel. William, does that resonate with you, that in the Christian mind, ultimately, Jesus was a kind of God Jr. and the Trinity is basically a mystery, although you may be trying to defend it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because every time... Go, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just... Because I have been speaking to Christians in a serious way for about 40 years of my life. Very serious conversations. And I have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and I try to keep the ratio. I try to listen a lot more than I talk. And I try to understand what is going on in the mind of the thinking Christian. And it seems to me that Christians see the behavior comports with the following map, that there is the Father, he's the great God. Jesus is a God in some way, and that the only way to come to the Father is through Jesus. And that is clearly stated in the Christian Bible. But if Jesus is God, what do you mean through him to get to him? You're him if he's him. And the idea that God, the Father, and the Son are one, John 10:30, is not what the gospel author had in mind as of the same substance, because we see that this word one is of the same purpose, as we see with Jesus in a huge prayer to God in John 17. In verse 11, Jesus asked God that the disciples should be one as we, God and Jesus, are one. Well, how could that be? That means of the same purpose. So this is a very late development, and I think Christians, I know Christians will be angry at me for saying this because it sounds very pretentious for me to say what is going on in the mind of serious evangelical Christians. But there's another thing, is that I have met many former Christians. Like I'm speaking to you, William, and I asked them, tell me what was going on, and they will concede this point. So I think that they're called upon to believe something that they can't actually cognitively reproduce. And it does not map on to the Christian Bible. Why? Because in the Christian Bible, Jesus is always subordinate to God. Now, one other point, I know I'm going to get 15,000 complaints from Christians. So I want to get this point across. So Christians will argue that, but if you look in John 10 as an example, which is something I raised, you see that the Jews did, we are told by the gospel author, that the Jews did perceive Jesus claiming to be God, and therefore wanted to kill him for blasphemy. Okay, and we see that in the Gospels. Again, Christians will argue back that in the Gospels, we are told, I don't believe these stories for a moment, but whatever, it's in the Gospels. So the Gospels clearly are stating that at different junctures, Jesus did or said things where the Jews apprehended these statements to mean that Jesus was claiming to be God. Okay? And they go, even the Jews in the Gospels had that perception. So you say that the Jews knew exactly what was going on, and Jesus was claiming to be divine. This is a mistaken argument, but everybody argues it, and I don't know why people aren't thinking this through. I'm not a Christian, and I could figure this out. In the Christian Bible, the Jews look horrendous. If you don't know this, you never read it. Moreover, more specifically, the Jews are wrong about everything. That's the whole point. The whole point is that Jews don't get it as portrayed, characterized in the Christian Bible. The Jews are portrayed in the most banal way imaginable, and this would have a catastrophic impact on the way Christians would view the Jews in the worst possible way. That's why Jews didn't fare very well in Christian lands. Okay, it's not the breast milk, it's the Christian Bible and the patristic writings that signed our death certificate. The point is that in the Christian Bible, the Jews are portrayed as people who don't get it. So the fact the Jews accuse Jesus of claiming to be God proves the opposite, proves that Jesus wasn't claiming to be God, because the point of the gospel author is you're not getting it. And in fact, in the Gospels, we are told that the Jews were willing to make up all kinds of false testimonies about Jesus in order to get him killed. It is brought before the high priest, before Pilate, and so on and so forth. This never, ever could have happened, ever, because the Jews had problems. Jews weren't interested in this. They had big problems in the year 30 or 33. Forget about this, okay? But the Jews are portrayed in this way, in the most horrific way, the way the Jews are portrayed in this screed called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a fiction. But we don't look very good in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a piece of filth that was produced by the Tsar's underlings in order to portray the Jews as the worst vermin in the world. Complete nonsense. The Jews have gatherings, meetings in order to control the world. So level number one, a Christian will say, I'm talking good people, not fakers, honest people, sincere people, is they will say what they believe. They will articulate the Trinity if they know it. But the question really is, how does that map onto their behavior? Because I believe that really is the essence of your question. And there, the Christian enters into a cognitive dissonance. And Christians convey this all the time. They admit the fact that the vast majority of Christians do not understand the doctrine of Trinity. Well, why don't they? Is religion only made for people with an IQ above 140? Well, what about an average person who doesn't get it? How do you do it? The answer is they can't do it. And this, I believe, more than anything, is the reason why Christians leave Christianity, is because they cannot accept the doctrine of the Trinity. The doctrine of the Trinity is a self-inflicted wound from which the church has never recovered. It's now the time for Christians to rethink all of this and to turn back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the true God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, how we could see the coming of the true Mashiach. Arise and shine, for your light has come. Let us hope that this knowledge and understanding will bring about the true redemption quickly in our time. Thank you for that thoughtful question.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נעשה בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה